Welcome to another episode of Catalyzing Radical Systemic Change, where in my own language it's all about discovering, mapping, and cross pollinating the various building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead. What do I mean with a planetary civilization for framing this specific podcast? Although some of the listeners may have heard some of the details, I want to frame it from a very biographical perspective. So I grew up as a community born child and mainly in a gardener's family. So we were working with the same plot of land for almost 50 years. Not a very big plot of land, but providing in abundance in a rather harsh middle European climate. So where the winters get really cold in abundance for a family of seven, meaning we had fruits and veggies almost all year round, and we're really living from our own produce. So when I grew up, this was obviously all unconscious to me. I met my great grandfather, my grandfather, and then my father, and then my brother studied permaculture and is also plotting a rather substantial size of land and providing food in abundance. So I grew up with this cyclical understanding of nature. And secondly, my father was very exposed to the North American, Native American traditions, mainly the Lakota tradition. So we were doing things like, I have a younger brother who's 15 months younger than me. So we were going into the woods and, like finding out what stuff we can eat in the forest. So having said all of that, I think and I sense and I feel and I've dedicated my life to the fact that I really think we're a threshold generation. I'm often using that word because we're at the same time becoming aware that the paradigm at large, let's say late stage capitalism, in a very extractive linear form, maximizes everything for a return on investment. And this can't be sustained. This way of, let's call it the operating system, for sure can't be sustained for many more generations ahead. So I don't want to introduce my podcast guest today. In between, I think New York, where he's flying back to where he lives, and Guatemala, where I have found my home, and where there is a very lively and vibrant indigenous culture, still very connected to the land. So to frame the podcast before handing over to my guest, who has been way more exposed than myself to a multiplicity of living and vibrant indigenous traditions, I want to frame the conversation because I think, to my knowledge, to my understanding, it's not about trashing everything Western, right? And it's also not about glorifying and putting on a pedestal everything indigenous. So the first paradoxical, I would call it an axiom, right, or a koan, is that we're invited to see and sense with both eyes. So holding in our awareness, our Western mind, the scientific mind, linear time, and on the other hand, a remembering, I would call it a sacred matrix of the things, the patterns, the cultures that have always been there in the deep time of human history. Having said all of that, I'm super stoked for this conversation in the context of paradigm collapse and a planetary remembering. Ryan, it's a great pleasure to have you in the room. And like always in the podcast, please share a couple of pivotal moments that connect you with the topic of today's podcast. The floor is yours.
Well, mahalo, brother. Thank you for having me. Beautiful introduction. Just some small topics to talk about today. So really excited to be here. And yeah, my name is Ryan. Some people call me Ra. Some people call me Dinga or Jean Wu, depending where I am. I've been traveling around the world for the last 15 years. So I've ended up being in about close to 70 countries over that time. And currently I'm calling in from New York. but I call the small town of Amatlan del Quetzalcoatl in Mexico my current home. And some pivotal moments in my bio, there are so many, but I'd say one of the first ones that really stuck with me was my time in Cameroon. I moved to Cameroon when I was 22 years old to figure out why 50% of the food was going to waste in farming confederations on the border of Nigeria in a small town called Bali Nyonga. And I was asked to go there by a professor from the university who his family was from that area, and they were being affected by something that they weren't able to figure out the root cause of. So they brought me and two other students who were interested in what was then called social entrepreneurship, and they brought us to Cameroon. And when I got to Cameroon, I'm 22, I really don't have that much exposure, but yet here I am with this posturing that I know something and that I've studied sustainability, therefore I can figure out what this problem is and diagnose it from the outside in, not having any context in that area whatsoever, and just go there and figure it out. So not only did I quickly learn that I didn't know anything, but I also quickly started to understand that colonialism and coloniality is still active and real. I also learned very quickly that some of the most impoverished people are some of the most joyous, and that maybe money isn't the ultimate proxy for happiness, and that I shouldn't really be talking about sustainability if I don't know how to grow a tomato. So working with these farmers and being in these areas and learning about coloniality, which is the ongoing ripple of the patterns that have resulted from colonialism, including trauma, including worldview and epistemic fracture, including all of these different things that I discovered, alongside seeing very simple things like in places where there's a lot of malaria and typhoid, they don't have the proper medicines, even in these villages. It really rerouted my desire to, at that point, what I thought was to be of service. I thought I was going to be in service to people, and I was going to be in service to planet, and I was going to be in service to whatever these sort of pie in the sky things are. And what I slowly then realized is that I am in no way in the position to actually do that. So it took my, which I didn't know at the time, arrogance, and put it into a space of humility. And humility is really important, being a human. The word humility and human share the same root word, just like humus, which means soil. So I slowly began to feel into these connections of humility and humus with the human condition or the human experiment. And that time in Cameroon was really, really powerful for me. I also was diagnosed with malaria and typhoid and had a near-death experience, and it was really, really powerful. And I ended up then going to learn to grow my own food because I thought I'm kind of a hypocrite talking about sustainability if I don't actually know how to sustain myself. And then I moved to the island of Oahu, where I met my first two spiritual teachers, and they kind of sent me on a pinball journey around the world, looking to acquire experiential comprehension and knowledge and wisdom, because they told me if I don't experience anything and I talk about it, it's just a claim. So the only actual real wisdom that's there is through experience. And that,
And let me tie into that, because I think we will in this conversation always jump from the meta to the very grounded experience. And I think you mentioned a couple of things that I think are of utmost importance. The one is unlearning. The other one, I would call it humility. And the third one is direct experience. So different to you, my first exposure was with a Zen Buddhist master, right, with whom I spent 22 years. And he was a very grounded, human, humble, monk. And he always told me a gram, like, because we're in the metric system in Europe, like a gram of experience is worth more than a ton of theory. And I think most of us Westerners starkly have a misrepresentation of a lot of accumulated knowledge, reading, the way our school systems and university systems are built. But again, they can't fix a flat tire, they can't grow their own food. So can you share some examples? Because really, I think the stunning feature of your biography is that you had a very deep exposure with multiple, like live, I wouldn't say intact necessarily, we can come to that later, but like lineages that have survived deep time and to a certain point also survived colonialism. Can you give the listeners some examples of, let's say, the Hawaiian tradition and how that shaped you early on to move from abstraction and thinking to lived experience?
Sure. Yeah, you mentioned a lot of really good stuff in there. So my Hawaiian teacher, his name's Kumu Ramsey, really amazing human. He told me pretty early on, he said, unless you empty your coconut, you're not going to be able to fill it with anything new. So this unlearning process is very, very important. And what I like to tell people about unlearning is that is learning, So you don't have to worry about this sunk cost thing, which I think is coming into play a lot with the process of unlearning, because I've learned how to do this for 30 years and here I am attempting to do this and now I need to forget everything that I knew. Like you said, it's not about trashing that stuff, but it's about recognizing that there are completely alternative, or what I'll call diversified, because the word alternative is kind of weird. It says alternative depending on the emphasis, but there are diverse ways to actually understand and to know and to comprehend and to be. So for me, the exposure into the Hawaiian or the Kanaka Maoli cosmovision and way of knowing was through really deeply, first my experience with the land, with the aina being that which feeds, not necessarily food, but could also be wisdom, because land also feeds you wisdom. And Kumu is a direct lineage holder of the tradition of Ho'oponopono, which has also been commodified and tokenized and extracted into 4 phrases, which some people might know. It's, I love you, please forgive me, I'm sorry, thank you. Now that seems easy, right? Bada bing, bada boom, all set. But the Ho'oponopono tradition is about making things pono, about making things aligned. And the tradition itself is actually really deeply intertwined with our memory and the continual samsaric repetition of conditions from the past that don't enable us in the present moment to open up a space for the future to be liberated from. So what I mean by that, I always give an example. So 2 women I love dearly, my mother and my sister. My mom has always told me she's a worrier. I say, why are you worrying about me? I'm just here in the mountains of Colombia with no shoes for 2 weeks, nothing to worry about, Well, my mom was a worrier. And I said, oh, was her mom a worrier too? Yeah, she was. And now my sister is a worrier. So for all intensive purposes, the question that I have is my sister in the past or is she in the future from my great-grandmother? Because the condition of worrying, which is not applicable to my sister currently, from the lineage that's been handed down from my great-grandmother's worry, which probably had some actual real survival issues happening in that time, has manifested itself through moments continuously that are not enabling my sister to be fully present in her experience. As Bio Akamolofe would say, the past is not yet done. So
Let me again tie into that, because now we can already apply in the dialogue this like 2-eyed seeing. And
Right.
I think after the first lineage tradition, it makes sense to frame this nugget. But before we unveil what we both mean with 2-eyed seeing, I want to tie into that with my own biography, because I spent multiple years, round about 3, deeply in intergenerational trauma healing, and before intergenerational trauma healing in family constellation work. Because in my early 30s, I basically found out, okay, I was thrown in there more through a relationship issue with my then partner. But going deeper into family constellation work, I was uncovering so many unbeknownst to me and unconscious patterns that I was carrying from the generation of my parents and my grandparents, because I grew up with my parents and my grandparents in one household, that I was blown away. I'm like, how can that even be that my way of relating to a woman is so closely ingrained and influenced by the relationship of my parents and the relationship of my grandparents? And I also still met my great grandparents, but I was not so close to them. So I think this is a good example, maybe to share. I really think a big nugget of wisdom. So if you don't mind, before we dive deeper, either in this wisdom tradition or lineage, or another one that you have been exposed to, let's explain the listeners what do we mean with two-eyed seeing and why it's so important to let go of sunk costs and opportunity costs when we talk about unlearning, because it's really with one eye what you have learned, and with the other one, like emptying yourself and opening yourself for a direct experience in the here and now, right? Which is a very paradoxical thing to do. So if you don't mind, because you're deeper in the framing and in the teaching of that, if you don't mind framing that and explaining that concept.
Yeah, sure. So to tie in just everything that you're saying, and then this last thread about my sister, is imagine this extrapolated into a collective level of worldviews, not mindsets. The mind is set in the worldview, but the worldviews, the actual value sets, and everything that has rippled throughout the past that is recreating itself and duplicating its patterns in the present moment. So a lot of what we call Western, and we have to be careful of that word because we live on a sphere, but a lot of what we call Western value sets is rooted in abstraction, objectification, quantification, and this observer separability, sometimes called the unholy trinity: mechanization, reductionism, and separation. So all of that being said, we have implemented a very progressing towards a specific direction of technological progress. Technologic, the logic of a machine. So prior to that logic, the original peoples and nations, since time immemorial, have operated in what's called an eco-logic, the logic of Earth. Their languages are built from the Earth within subjectivity, within relativity, and their ways of living still currently are preserving about 80% of the world's biodiversity. So two-eyed seeing is a Mi'kmaq. It's from the Mi'kmaq tradition in what's currently called Canada. The word is etuap the monk. That's the word for two-eyed seeing. Because right now, we're basically walking around with one eye shut, and we're attempting to understand why we continue to strive for solutions and we're striving for progress, and yet we continue to spiral around in the same sort of patterns. And it's said another way, the Achuar talk about the bird with two wings, the left and the right wing. The left wing, you can talk about it in the same way you're talking about two-eyed seeing. But if one of the wings is much stronger than the other one, the bird kind of spins around in a circle continuously, attempting to get somewhere, but we're just spinning. And two-eyed seeing is a really innovative approach that the Mi'kmaq is, Albert Marshall is his name, he came up with to start to interpret reality, for example, with multiple different sciences, with multiple different epistemologies or ways of knowing. And what that does is that creates an actual holistic interface for worldviews and ways of being to come into the picture so that we can have them meet and talk with each other, so that we're not continually trying to solve the crisis from the same lens that has created the crisis. Or to put it another way, as Einstein said, you can't solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it. So two-eyed seeing is a really valuable tool and methodology of working with different wisdoms and knowledges. And as you said before, knowledge not in this conceptual, intellectual capacity, but knowledge in the gnosis embodied knowing capacity. And when you can actually start to interface these things and work with both worldviews and work with both information sets that have various different time lenses, then we can actually start to create something that interfaces together to create solutions, which in music they call the overtone. It's this third space. It's when two things come together and a third thing is created from that. And that for me is really the value of two-eyed seeing. And for me, the only applicable way that we're going to start to actually have solutions, as opposed to things that continually duplicate the same patterning of the problem that we're attempting to solve.
Beautiful. I want to quote a human being that I really dearly love and have met before he became famous. His name is Charles Eisenstein. And he got famous quoting that in our hearts, we know the more beautiful world that is possible. For the sake of this conversation, and then I just adore your language because English is not my mother tongue, so some of the more poetic expression of myself may still be reserved to my German, as I reckon the listeners can extrapolate from my accent. So I want to just frame a couple of paradoxes, and then I'm really curious how you tie into that from your exposure with these different lineages. So, for example, 11 years ago, in an ayahuasca ceremony, I received one of the deepest, I would say, karmic healing experiences, because I grew up as a left-wing community activist permaculture child. So the way that I did perceive the world at large as a child was totally overwhelming for me, because it didn't make any sense whatsoever. Like war, destruction, environmental degradation at large. So and I couldn't reconcile that. And in that ayahuasca vision, which is still like very deeply in my cellular matrix, I received the vision that I say, for me, it's maybe 250 to 500 years in the future. So most likely, at least that's my assumption, I won't be able to truly see, perceive, and live that experience. But in that experience, I was seeing our mother planet, let's call it Mother Earth, right? And me as the earthling from the outside being connected to other star systems and species. And it was an amalgamate of a positive, like protopian, utopian vision, where we as a human species grew up and we got our shit together. And it was not like a going back to the Stone Age. There was technology. There was even interstellar travel. There were all sorts of crazy technologies. But in that vision, on a very visceral level, I had this: we can make it as humanity to steward this planet, in peace and harmony and ecological abundance for the many generations ahead. So what I mean with that is, with this two-eyed seeing, you, the listener, is invited that one of the paradoxes that you need to hold for us as being a threshold generation and putting the seedlings into the soil, many of which we may not see until full fruition, because these cycles take way longer than just one human lifespan. And I think for me, I found a deep peace in that, right? To do my best and let go that ultimately what I want to steward may come to full fruition in my own lifetime. And that teaches me a lot of humility in my monumental undertakings. And I know you're also into monumental stuff. Anyhow, Ryan, from the Hawaiian tradition, you mentioned the Canadian tradition. Forgive me if I can't recall the exact words of this two-eyed seeing. Can you give a more practical example of how they taught you this, or how you teach that to the people that you're working with?
Sure. The way that I've been taught is by watching and then doing and then messing up a lot and then figuring it out along the way. Because a lot of the teachers, they say, well, I can teach you it and you can try to copy everything that I do, but ultimately that's my style, that's not your style. So you can watch and learn, and learning is messing up again and again and again, not making mistakes, because you can't learn without making mistakes. So learning is just a part of making mistakes is just a part of learning. But in a real applicable way, how to actually work with this, and I want to connect what you said at the beginning, just so people can see that these words are relatively synonymous. When we're talking about paradigm collapse, right? A worldview is a paradigm. A paradigm is a pattern. Sometimes you could call a pattern a dimension. So a lot of what we're working with here is being able to grapple with what's happening in our current crises. Crises being the Greek word etymologically said the same way, which means choice. In this moment of choice for this threshold species, as you're saying, we're in a rite of passage about how to make choices in the proper way. And all of the ways that I've been taught is you have to learn how to make choices in the proper way. And by proper way, I mean affirmative for all of life, not just for human life, not just for the I. And in this planetary species that you're talking about, this shift in identity, illness and wellness are two words that I use because it's very clear in its spelling. One has I and one has we. And right now we have a lot of illness because of this identity, this individualism. And when you're making decisions and when you're truly a leader, at least the leaders that I've been with, when like you're in the inipi and you're sitting in the sweat lodge and there's a little water that might go around if you're lucky. And the chief drinks last. And if there's no water, he doesn't drink, And that's the opposite of what's happening right now with most of the leadership that I see in the world. It's that it's all being siphoned up and leaving the people without anything. So a lot of this work and a lot of the way that I've been taught is through this subversion, this energy of how to look at something and then flip it. And not flip it like reverse it, but flip it in the way of subversion, meaning recognize the polarity of how it's built out. For example, I use the example of privilege a lot. It's not that privilege is bad. It is what it is. But why do we have privilege and how do we utilize that in the proper way? Privilege, for me, what it came to me when I was up in Alaska studying with one of my teachers up in Sitka, privilege is the ability to repair the conditions of what caused it. Because ultimately, there's been this energy that has continually extracted and continually taken from the earth, which is not just the earth, it's all of us together, which is part of this shift in our responsibility, right? As you said, and what you mentioned really beautifully, the shift in our comprehension of time from a short time to a deep time, and working with the responsibility of what it truly means to be a human, a keystone species here that cares for the human and more than human life. And I don't think that really necessarily answered your question, but the way that they've been taught, and therefore the way that they teach me, is that we have to be able to come to our own way of knowing. And if we can come to our own way of knowing, eventually, by utilizing these two eyes, then it's not going to be the pharmaceutical model where you always have to go back to the same person over and over, and then they give you something, but then it hurts something else, and they have to go back and pay them again for this. And next thing you know, you have a knee, an elbow, and a stomach issue, and you started out with a sore toe. So the way that they teach is it's about healing. It's not about curing. And there's a really big difference between those two words. And one of my teachers, Dr. Tusi, he says, good leaders lead, great leaders heal. And for me, that's really what this is all about. Healing, etymologically meaning to reclaim wholeness. So if we can do that in the proper way, and you learn in that way, always looking at root causes, not necessarily addressing symptoms, but seeing how to actually work with this multidimensional field that we're in, what we can call physical, cognitive, mental, intellectual, emotional, somatic, and spiritual, not separate, but able to be nuanced and diversified. If you're moving and being taught in that way, then you're always going to be able to come to your own way of knowing and assist other people in coming to that way of knowing just by who you are and how you act.
In framing the next chapter, I want to touch upon both your and my exposure to indigenous lineages and plant medicine. And I want to frame that before we dive into that, because it's become somewhat an epiphenomenon on top of indigenous lineages being tokenized and extracted from. So, for reasons I don't want to dive deeper, but for whatever reason, I was like late in my own biography to psychedelics. And the deepest transformation in my 30s, so around about 10 years ago, 12, 15 years ago, happened through a very deep work with ayahuasca. And in hindsight, I personally was lucky that I had a master on my side, a woman, a female shaman, that without her ever mentioning that, basically was seeing me with two eyes. She was seeing me from a Western educated therapeutical perspective. So she was able to help me integrate a lot of these very powerful transmissions and transmutations. So there's almost there's a multiplicity of questions and many of them open-ended that I want to explore with you. First of all, why do you think that Westerners specifically are so attracted to plant medicine? Secondly, why do many of them, including myself, overdo it? So instead of doing a ceremony every now and then, they just do like way too much of that. And many of them don't integrate it ever. At least that's how I see and sense the field at large. Thirdly, why, in my own assumption, this just supercharges bullshit egos, meaning super successful people that have done a plethora of different plant medicines, but are still not humble. They're really not humble. They think they are, but they're obviously not, especially men, right? And how does this relate to your own experience? And yeah, anyhow, these are just a couple of open-ended questions with whom I'm sitting for now, yeah, over a decade, right? It's a big phenomenon. I would say hundreds of millions of Westerners abuse plant medicine, even in a indigenous lineage-led setting.
The attraction to medicine is obviously different for everybody, but ultimately, if we're calling for the reason about why Westerners are attracted to it, I think it provides a quick fix to feeling. And modernity has created a lot of anesthesia and a lot of amnesia. So part of what the medicines do very rapidly, which I mean, depending which medicine you're talking about, if you're talking about bufo, I mean, you're just shot up and back in like 15 minutes, shorter than it might take you to go ride to your work. So this really rapid catalyzation of feeling and remembering or tapping into a field that you've never felt in your entire life, I think that that's the attraction. I also think that that's why people continue to overdo it, because when you become a spiritual orphan, someone who has been uprooted and disassociated from their own lineage, and you're now looking to find lineages to make you whole again, it becomes an addicting feeling when you continue to go into all of these different states, these expanded states of awareness. And the integration, like you're saying, that's lacking is because a lot of the systems that we live in are not capable of handling expanded states of awareness, nor is a lot of the awareness rooted in the where. You could put awareness, yeah? So we still have the same worldview, right? It's about me as an individual human on this backdrop of earth and nature being one of the most insidious words in the English language because it means that we're not her. So we're going into these ceremonies without the protocol, without the relational architecture of the worldview and the paradigm that the cultures have worked with from the earth, and how to work with the medicines, and what the medicines and the spiritual work that you do is then integrated back into. There isn't this circle of reciprocity between the person, the medicine, the culture, the land, and all of this way to bring the spirituality back into itself, because the plants are enlisting us to work with them. I look at it in a different way because I work with the Mazatec, and one of the ways that we look at it is, yeah, a lot of people consume mushrooms, but the mushrooms are far older than us. So perhaps the mushrooms are actually enlisting us in some sort of work that they want us to do. So the question for me is, why would all of these plants be coming about at this point in time, during this threshold, during this liminal space, especially something like mushrooms, as paradigms are collapsing? Another word for collapse, you could say decomposing. And the mycelial intelligence being something that's interconnecting. How do we actually start to work with the wisdom of the plants, which are far older than us? They're our ancestors. How do we recognize that they're actually asking us to do something, as opposed to only us
Let's
needing
stay
something
there.
from
I want
them?
to dovetail into that because I couldn't agree more. And this, what you shared, maybe it's not us doing the plant medicine. Maybe it's the plants almost imposing, right, the deeper work that we're asked to do. And I'm curious how you will reflect that back. I think in hindsight, I was lucky that I never changed my circle. So 11 years, and we were working with ayahuasca, mushrooms, both peyote and wachuma, so mescaline and iboga, in the same setting, the same group for 11 years. Secondly, there's now a pointer to the listeners. I had a thousands of year old lineage transmission from a embodied spiritual master. In my tradition, it was Zen Buddhism. So I had a daily practice, or an almost daily practice. So it helped me navigate through my own practice these extraordinary states of consciousness. And then thirdly, in my specific case, I had a teacher that helped me to feel through my own trauma, because I have an early childhood trauma accident. And it helped me also to feel through the intergenerational trauma that I was carrying. So I would say community. I recommend to anybody who asks me to open a door or open a ceremony, I always say, well, with whom will you work to integrate these extraordinary states of consciousness? Which for me is, again, this two-eyed seeing, letting go of everything you know, because if you truly have ever done a hero dose, double, triple hero dose of just quote unquote mushrooms, which they call the niños, like the children, or you have done ayahuasca, or you're just intrigued by it, the likelihood that everything that you have ever experienced, everything that you think you are, everything that you think you hold will just be blasted away in either a couple of minutes or a couple of hours. And what you call your ego is like grinded down to dust. So ideally, for me, this was the most profound experience, especially with ayahuasca, is like, I don't know shit. This plant is way more powerful than myself, and this teaches me humility. So I would say especially the encounter with ayahuasca, should be a profound experience of humility. So, what I want to segue into is again this paradox of, if you have been working like the two of us, me at least, for like plus a decade in traditional lineage settings, is indigenous themselves don't hold a concept of integration. But I think in whatever shape or way or form, integration couldn't be more important to truly transmute yourself, because worldviews are sticky, right? And then people do ceremonies and ceremonies and ceremonies, and they just supercharge bullshit ego. So I'm curious, yeah, how you reciprocate that.
Yeah, I'll share about someone that a lot of people are familiar with, which is Abraham Maslow. So, for those of you who aren't familiar, the top of Maslow's pyramid is self actualization. He later revised it, thank God, and he came back and he said self transcendence. Transcendence being different than ascension. So, what a lot of people don't know is that that pyramid, Maslow was working with the Siksika people, who is the Blackfoot nation. It's currently called Canada. And the pyramid was originally a teepee, and at the base of the teepee was self actualization. So, why I'm saying this is because the egoic amplification that can happen through the plants, if you don't recognize that we're the youngest species here on the planet rather than the most evolved, if you don't recognize that, then you're going to think that you're the peak of creation and that you individually can get to some specific state, which maybe you can, but that is all about you. When in the teepee, the self-actualization is the base. Yeah. So in order to get to cultural continuity and the continuity of life, which is at the peak of the teepee, you have to know who you are already. Right. So as opposed to this being the pinnacle of our life, which is to reach some individualized state, we have to utilize our individuated state, our uniqueness, and knowing who we are to actually be able to build towards the continuity of the thing that's more than us, which is the earth and which is the spirit, and which is this thing that you're calling this multi-generational perspective on how to build things and align ourselves with life. And when we understand or comprehend that this anthropocentrism and this human exceptionalism is a myth, and like you said, these worldviews are very sticky because they're continually validated through all of the different means of education and normally the environments that we're in. But when you recognize that the entire point of us being here as humans is to steward and continue life with more beauty and more ability to thrive and more ability for abundance being something that is only real when shared, then you start to recognize, rethink. You start to rethink why you're doing these medicines. Because if we don't take care of the things that take care of us, we don't get to be here. And this is something that doesn't seem to stick yet in the minds of a lot of people, and especially in a lot of the systems, is that you have to give before you receive. We don't even receive, we just take. Yeah. But you have to give something first, and then you receive, and then you give. So this process of it's actually threefold. But the first part that you have to give a part of you. And that's the beautiful part about ceremonies, yeah, is if you don't bring something to the fire to create more light, then the fire goes out. So you always have to give something first. And I think that this helps me at least reconstruct why I'm doing this, you know?
It's not often that I weigh my words, but I'm very, very touched by this conversation. I want to sprinkle in. I was an altar boy and that Zen Buddhist master with whom I spent 22 years was actually at the same time also a Benedictine monk who got excommunicated by the Pope. It's actually not that easy, right? So, and he was a lineage holder, and he got granted 100 million Deutschmark and built the biggest spiritual center in all of Europe. It's actually 4 times the size of Tishnatan. But outside of Germany, he's very little known. And he always put it down to very brass tack simple things. And I like that, right? He always said, you know what, Alistair? I don't care so much about what people say or think or feel, even. What I really care about is what they're doing, referring obviously in that Christian context to the Sermon of the Mount. You will know them by their deeds. So this is a pointer to some of the listeners just becoming more sensitive and aware, especially in spiritual circles, especially people that say that they have spent a lot of time in plant medicine and they did a lot of ayahuasca. Like, what are these people actually really doing, right? How do they earn their living? How do they treat the other human beings? Because I think when you really closely observe what people do and how they do it, in between the fine lines of the behavior, right? I think you see the true quality of a human being. And again, I personally really do not even care if people have done plant medicine or not, if they have been exposed to a lineage, because I grew up in a very simple setting, right? I mean, my grandfather was he was a car mechanic and he was a gardener and he was a good guy. He was helping the neighbors and painting fences. He was a little bit, I'm very close to my grandfather, you know, a little bit hyperactive guy, you know, just helping people in the neighborhood and doing his gardening work and repairing cars up until he died at the age of 85. He was a simple human being. He didn't even finish primary school because of the Second World War. So this very early on taught me that a rank in a society or how much people are paid says hardly anything, right, about the true quality, about the true reciprocity that these people feel that they're giving. Because we always had surplus in the garden and we really didn't know that much what to do with it. Just apples, blackberries, zucchinis, cucumbers, whatever. There was just too much of it for a family of 7. What were we doing? Well, we were walking around to all the other people who thought we were crazy because we did this permaculture thing and just handing out the stuff and basically, hey, you want cucumbers, you want zucchini, you want like apples, because there's just too much in the garden, right? We can't eat that all up or conserve it for winter. So two-eyed seeing we have covered. Is there anything from the 5 traditions that you're working with that you feel like you still want to share with the listeners? I think we have covered the Hawaiian tradition, how that got tokenized, the two-eyed seeing, the decomposing nature of plant medicine and why so many people I would say almost get abused by the plants, because if you're not becoming aware, these plants also can get abused, abuse you. We haven't talked about the Virarika that we're both deeply working with, like the guardians of the peyote. Is there something specifically about that culture, like a nugget of wisdom that you want to convey, what you learned with the Virarika or the Huichol, how are they known in Spanish language?
Yeah, I mean, they're just a very, very special people. But for me, one of the main things that I've learned from them is the consciousness of offering. So for me, offering is the antidote to extraction, because you start to recognize that it's not all about you and that you aren't even all about you. Like they say, you could lose your eye, your leg, or your ear and still be totally fine. But if you lose the food, the air, or the water, you die. So which one's actually your body? And this dissolving, this decomposition of the other, yeah, what we can call the double mirror. which goes back to Ho'oponopono. What is it about me that allows me to see something in you that bothers me about you? What is it about us as a collective species that continually creates things outside of ourselves that we then always have to fix, which puts us in suffering because we always have to fix it? What is it about us that continues to extract the very body that we require to live without the recognition that we need to feed and take care of the body that we need to actually live? And when we can actually start to work with the world as mirror, that will actually help our evolution, because Earth is a school, at least the way it's been told to me. And if you don't learn the lesson, you don't get to change grades. And what keeps happening is it's like Billy Madison. Yeah. He's like a 30-year-old guy in third grade. So we're not really advancing. We're not seeing what the lesson is because we always try to fix a problem. And when there's always a problem, there's always going to be a solution. When there's always a solution, there's always going to be a problem. So you're going to be stuck in this binary as opposed to be listening to what the lesson is so that you don't recreate the same problem again that you have to fix. And what I've learned with the Wararika and a lot of other people is the importance of listening also. Listening is the first stage of intelligence. Maybe not the first stage of intellect, but it definitely is the first stage of intelligence. Intelligence being the energy to create the advancement and benefit of the entire system of life, which is why I think it was Jane Goodall. She says, humans are the most intellectual species on the planet, but definitely not the most intelligent. So what I've learned in a lot of these cultures is what we can call relational intelligence, or what we could call relativity. Because one of my uncles, he's like, Albert Einstein, cool guy, right? Theory of relativity. I was like, yeah, I love that guy. He's awesome. He's like, yeah, well, we knew that already in Lakota. Metakoye oyasin, to all my relatives. That's relativity right there. Recognize that each and every species here is your relative. And I don't know how you treat your relatives, but if we look at how humans are treating all these other species and all these other beings, it doesn't really feel like a family reunion to me.
What I like is when I sense attention. I just want to voice it. So yes, I agree that seemingly, from what we perceive in media, the paradigm collapse, the social dilemma, now the AI dilemma on top, seems like a 30-year stuck in third grade. My perception, though, and I'm not saying it's the truth, has slightly changed, especially in, I would say, the last 5 years or so post-COVID. I think that we as the threshold generation and many people like us here having these very humble, not knowing dialogues, wanting to inspire other people, take the next step, doing initiation, do plant medicine, do integration, connect to their purpose, connect to deep time, connect to wisdom traditions, bridge these two eyes of the Western mind, the rational mind, the objectifying mind, linear time, with deep time and circular time. There are many like us. So what I mean with that is, whereas I would really say as a child and as an adolescent and as an early adult, I didn't have hope. I didn't have hope for us. Not as a species, not as a planetary civilization. And I don't know what happened, but on a kernel level, so whatever, if you have a kernel, if the kernel is the void, but let's say the kernel around the void, right? Like this thing which makes me get up in the morning, having sparkles in the eyes, working hard, trying to make a difference, doing this podcast, right? Like all the sum total of everything that I'm doing is fueled by a flame of hope. So in as much as I agree with you, I want to nuance that. So, and I think it's a beautiful segue actually in this conversation for everyone that survived, the podcast up until here, is like, what the fuck is Ryan actually doing? Right? We've been talking a lot about concepts, lineage traditions. I've been sprinkling in some, like details from my biography. What are you actually doing? And why do you think, like a classical why, how, what, who, like almost like a golden circle? Why do you think that makes a difference? And what gives you hope?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm also hopeful, and I'm hopeful in my action. Because one of my teachers told me once, he said, I don't really hope too much because hope is in a future state, and that doesn't make me do anything now. So being hopeful in my action, what do I actually do, and why do I think this is important, and for who and for what and for all these things? So a lot of the work that I do, I call it relational systems architecture. So within the current systems thinking paradigms, I run an unschool. So I help to decondition leaders and business professionals about how they think about systems or don't. And how do you approach situations with a pluriversal intelligence rather than a single way of looking at the world? What that does is increase creativity and innovation, but it does it in a way that it weighs relational ecocentric intelligence in equilibrium with transactional technological intelligence. Because these one-eyed systems that we're working with are creating knowledge and power without wisdom. So we're actually not really able to understand why we have the knowledge, which is what the point of wisdom is. We can know everything in the world. If we don't know why we know it, it doesn't really do us very good. So I run this systems thinking unschool called Rebiz that builds curricula for organizations and leaders who actually want to diversify their ability to innovate in pluriversal worldviews in ecocentric ways. You can call that regenerative, you can call that post-growth, you can call it whatever you want. I also run immersions with various different elders from around the world, lineage holders, as you're mentioning, and we focus on the worldview and the culture and the language of those traditions. We bring in the medicines as ways of continual deeper connection and healing. And also, we then weave that into the systems. And how do you actually build future thinking systems rooted in ancestral tradition, which is what Aitan Krenak would call futuro ancestral, the ancestral future. So without roots, there's no fruits. And part of the issue with a lot of the systems is they're decontextualized, disassociated systems without roots. So the fruits aren't really going to come. In addition to that, I am a leading steward of the original living responsibilities, which is this alchemy of the sustainable development goals and the inner development goals that's focused on indigenous guided paradigm transformation for organizations that are grappling with systemic and climate shifts. Because for me, and if you could find a common thread here, I'm very deep in the paradigm, deep in the worldview transformation. So that ripples into pragmatic applications and steps. But ultimately, as Donella Meadows mentioned, and she's an MIT scientist who studied the leverage points of systems change, worldview is the strongest lever of systems change. So until we diversify and make plural the intelligences that we're taking into consideration, actually, then all of the responsibility that we have and the agency that we have to shift the way that our organizations do things and the way that our businesses and entrepreneurial projects and our relations and all of these different things, we're going to continue to be contorted back into the same paradigm if we don't diversify the intelligences that we're utilizing. And to put one last way, I was just at Davos and a couple of these different places, and everyone's talking about solutions. But for me, what I recognize and what a lot of the elders teach me is a solution has to come from two things connecting that create a third thing that is of both, but neither. And when I see a lot of the solutions being reported, they're not necessarily solutions. They're things that are going to assist in, kind of like if you have a big cut, you got to like tourniquet it, right? You can stop the bleeding, you can do less harm, but that's not the infrastructure of the liminal space of the threshold generation that's going to actually birth the systems that our hearts know are possible, to quote Eisenstein, as you mentioned before. So a lot of the ways that we are positioning this, from siloed, disconnected metrics and siloed, disconnected investments, we have to start viewing things in a different capacity, in an entangled, interconnected way of relational intelligence. And that's actually going to advance the systems and the innovations and creativity that our organizations design and live into for the future generations. So we become ancestors worth descending from. And that's really some of the work that I do. So I hope that explains a little bit.
I want to pick on a couple of things there to segue into the next chapter. I really like how you frame your connection to deep time, to be proud of us as our own ancestors. This feels very much aligned in a daily meditation. Like, and just recently I was having a deeper download on my own deep time imagining, because I usually always take this 7 generations approach. And I'm like, okay, if my actions are really worth it, 7 generations down the line, don't mind if they recall my name or a picture. It's not about that. Can they really say, okay, Alistair tried the best that he could, right? She said, no, it needs to be at least 10,000 years. I'm like, okay, that's a bunch of generations more. So anyhow, that's the deep time component. And the other one, which I think should be a major nugget also for the listeners, is if you truly understand that your own worldview and the worldview of others that you can influence through whatever shape or way or form you're showing up has the deepest and most profound ripple effect for us, possibly, hopefully, really stewarding, the systems that we want to put into fertile soil for the many generations ahead. In the context of deep time, it's kind of funny that you were not familiar with that concept, because in my podcast I use it very often, though slightly heretic and not down to the point, because originally it comes from McKinsey, right? Is the Horizon 1, 2, 3 framework. So if we connect to the hope in our hearts and in our nervous system, in our cells, what is your hope for your work, your specific context in the next few years? Let's say 1 or 2. What's a more mid-size positive hope future you envision? Let's say maybe 10 years or something like that. And what is then either your own vision from your deathbed? So if we both assume we will still die and not be like living forever or something like that, or truly a more deep time question, how the seedlings that you put into the earth may survive your own physical mortality. So 3 timelines, and what are the pictures and the emotions and maybe tangible results attached to that.
Mm-hmm. So for the Horizon 1, I am actively, but I would like to see the deeper relationship between people who are actively bridging these worldviews in action. So with Original Living Responsibilities, we're creating something called Living Bridges, which is a way for all of the different people who are allies and who are walking in these both worlds. And there's not really 2 worlds, there's only one, but we can say it in this way for lack of a better way. But the first stage is to unite and connect all of these certain people and equip them with the ability to utilize this framework of 2-eyed seeing to actually create true innovation and solutions moving forward for the future. That is organizations, that's individual people and various other people who understand and recognize the depth and importance of this for systems transition and systems evolution. The second one is something I'm also building, but it's a little bit more longer term, and it's building out an entire different sector of decision intelligence about how to utilize this so that every single thing can start to apply this way of knowing in a systematized capacity, so that every single decision is made with this intelligence. And the third one, the seeds of the future. I mean, I'm on my deathbed. I would just like to have joy and be happy and feel like I lived a really good life, and hopefully be surrounded by my children, and they're like, thank you very much. I love you, and safe transition. See you later, But really, I like to use the baobab tree, because the baobab tree sometimes takes hundreds of years to really start to bear fruit. So to create this beautiful future, we have to do that work now. And in order for that future to have fruits, we have to reroot it. So on the deeper level, I think all of my work and everything that I'm doing, including on my own individuated basis, is about making sure that the roots are very firm, because in moments of high turbulence and in moments of high wind, which we could call some of the things that we're about to go through as a species, if you don't have roots, you get blown over pretty quickly, So resilience has roots. And to build things of true resilience that don't just enable humans to survive, but enable them to thrive and to evolve in this Earth school, that's my longer term vision. So that everything we do is evolutionary, not just survivability.
So beautifully shared your deathbed vision. I want to do something which I hardly ever do, but is almost together, like ending the podcast and framing the nuggets. I will go first. So first of all, if you want to truly, meaning talking to the listeners, if you truly want to have a transmission of a lineage, of a lived culture, of a lived tradition, don't trust a Westerner, usually a guy, but really sit with the Marakame, the head shaman. And at best, the Westerner is invited to play a function in the ceremony. That's at least, that's why I connected you and Angel, my dear friend, with whom I recorded the prior episode solely focusing on the Virari culture. Or in my context of Zen Buddhism, if you really want to do Zen Buddhism, sit with a dude who has done that for 30, 40, 50 years, not just like 5 years and shows up as an enlightened, non-dual Advaita Vedanta dude. Thirdly, if you subjectively have the feeling you can't quite land all these transformative experiences with plant medicine and flying to Peru or wherever or smoking bufo, right? Make sure you choose the right companion, because other people can very well judge your own integration. I was always choosing my parents, my grandparents. I was really asking them. I'm like, hey, I do all this work. Do you have the feeling I'm really happier? I really contribute better. I'm more powerful. I'm more grounded. I'm more equilibrated, right? These are the fruits of the path. And then maybe lastly, because I get asked a lot on all channels, can you recommend me a ceremony and I need this and that, is like, please be cautious. Rather do a couple of test calls, make yourself familiar who is hosting the ceremony, because this is really like surgery, right? You wouldn't go to a hospital and say, I have a problem with my eye. Somebody needs to open up my eye, right? You wouldn't give your eyesight to like Joe Average, right? You would need to make sure, at least try to make sure, that your research really proves that the surgeon opening your eye has done this for a bunch of years and learned it prior for a bunch of years. And then maybe finally, which is the worldview thing, humility, 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 humility. It's almost, I don't know, it's just really, for me, that's the almost one of the base codes, right? Like, try to be humble, try to learn, try to contribute, stumble, try to get up, try to be a better human being. Anyhow, do you have something at the end of the podcast that you still feel like sharing, Ryan?
Yeah, the one thing that is coming to my mind right now is a moment from one of our dear teachers. She's a Mexican woman from the north of Mexico. And she said, the most powerful position to be in is the position of I don't know. Why? Because if you've continually lived your life thinking that you know, and the results of what you've created don't validate that, then it's really important for you to say, I don't know, because it opens you up for the potentiality to know. And right now, in our systems and in the climate and nature space and all of a lot of the businesses and things that we're doing, we keep telling ourselves that we know where we're going, that we know what to do, that we know. And this way of seeing, this way of being, to bring it in with the humility of I don't know, it will open us up to so many vast probabilities and potentials where we'll eventually finally recognize and get to the place where we do know. And I think that this, for me, is, if I can leave anyone with anything, recognize that if you don't know, that's a very strong place to be, because you're opening yourself up for infinite learning and infinite transformation and evolution. And that's what the world is asking of us right now, is to quantum leap by utilizing our unknowing to get to a place of learning and connection.
Okay, Ryan. This is like, I had such a profound download that I need to share it. So, when I started my journey with that Buddhist master, who at the same time was a Benedictine monk, but he was also in Rinzai Zen, right? Which they give you a paradoxical thing to solve. And he just gave me, thy will be done. That's it. Never gave me one other koan. I was chewing on that for over a decade. And then I had a darshan, like a personal meeting with the guy, and I'm like, I got it. And he's like, cool. And no, it was so funny, we were both hilariously laughing. And then he's like, well, do you have a question? I'm like, no, I don't have a question. He's like, well then. So in the apocryphic scriptures, so the non-canonical scriptures of the Bible, right, the Gnosis, right, they say those who search must search up until they know. And when they know for sure. But for me, this was a 20-year-long journey, right? Which is fucking hilarious, because when you kind of got it, which then at the same time you still don't have, and after the peak comes another peak, right? It all becomes like fucking hilarious. But for me, it was a 20-year personal journey. So Ryan, I truly hope this podcast will ripple out, connect you with the right people. May it provide you yourself those lineages that you're connected with more support, more abundance, financially, supporters, guardian angels, all of it. Ryan, I'm super grateful we had that conversation. I have the feeling it's truly really just the beginning of us starting to deeper sense into our relationship. And I want to thank you for the mix of this beautiful two-eyed language that you have, which is incredibly precise and very poetic at the same time. So thanks so much for this podcast, Ryan.
Thank you, brother. I really enjoy our conversation. So, mahalo.